Welcome to Design Downtime, the podcast where we celebrate the joys of living a balanced creative life. I'm your host, Guy Siegel, a design director in Toronto, Canada, and I invite you to join me on this journey as we redefine what it means to be a successful design professional. Let's break free from the shackles of hustle culture and embrace the full spectrum of human experience, because life is too precious to be spent only in pursuit of productivity. Today, I'm excited to talk to Joe Natoli. Joe is a UX consultant, author, and speaker. For 3 decades, he's advised, trained, and empowered the UX, design, and product development teams of some of the world's largest organizations, from Fortune 100 companies to US government agencies and startups. He has published 10 books and is a regular keynote speaker and lecturer at industry conferences and corporate events across the globe. Joe has also taught more than 350,000 students through his online courses and his own UX 365 Academy, in addition to a private coaching practice. Joe's approach to improving product UX and design focuses on addressing systemic and personal dynamics issues across individuals, teams, and organizations, fighting impostor syndrome and increasing self-confidence, improving communication and collaboration, addressing fear and dysfunction driving poor management practices, and redesigning inappropriate, counterproductive processes. Joe lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife Ellie and 3 kids, and he strives to be the person his dog Rosie thinks he is. Welcome to the show, Joe.
Thank you, sir. What an introduction. What an introduction. I left out the part about being a total music and record nerd.
I don't think it's a secret, and that is why you're here today, to talk about specifically your love of metal music.
Yes. Oh, God. Where do we even begin? Metal is and has always been a constant in my life from the first time I ever heard. I think my introduction was Black Sabbath's Master of Reality. My cousin came to stay over my house. We were like brothers growing up. So we were always at each other's houses. And he came over one night and he brought, I think, 4 or 5 of his father's records. I remember the soundtrack to Jimi Hendrix, the film, being one of them. And Black Sabbath's Master of Reality was the other one. So he puts on Master of Reality first. And it starts with, the cough, which is already cool. They're like, wow, that's really cool. And then that riff comes in, that sludgy, massive, sold instantly. Sold. I'm like, what is this? How do I get more of it? And it snowballed from there.
How old were you?
Oh, I was young. I want to say I was, this is somewhere hovering around 10. I mean, my memory is terrible at 55 going on 56, but I was young. I was way before my teenage years. To me, it sounded like superhero type stuff come to life because I was a comic book kid as well, right? I was really into comic books. And this was just larger than life on every possible scale. There's one other thing that constitutes, that kind of had to do with it as well, but we'll talk about that in a second. You were going to say something.
Yeah, I'm curious to know, what music were you exposed to by that point in your life?
I was going to say, the only thing that had come close to that, but I don't consider this metal, okay? Although the look was sort of metal. Kiss was my earliest exposure to anything on that scale, right? And I was in love with the look immediately again because I was a comic book guy, I was a horror movie guy, and I'm like, wow, like this is some weird combination of comic book superhero and movie monsters come to life, So I was the same thing. I was obsessed with this band. The only music I'd been exposed to before that would have been sort of more traditional stuff. I mean, my mother was into like Motown type stuff, like Diana Ross and the Supremes or Gladys Knight, soul type stuff, some jazz things like George Benson. My dad was real into 50s music, doo-wop, and the classics like typical crooners like Frank Sinatra, Tony Bennett. There was some Paul Anka in there. He was a Barry Manilow fan. I mean, so I was exposed to a lot. But there were certain things, when I heard them, I had an uncle who was is sort of a product of the 60s and 70s, right? So the whole hippie movement and psychedelic stuff and folk music to prog rock to, there's one I'm leaving out here, typical 70s hard rock. I mean, it was all in there, right? So I got exposed to all this stuff at an early age. I mean, the first time my cousins and I at a younger age heard Green Onions, Booker T and the MG's instrumental Green Onions. We thought that was the coolest thing we had ever heard. Like just this funky little, and we played that every chance we could get. We found the record, I think, at my grandmother's house. The other thing I remember, and this is random, it's all over the place, is at my father's mother's house, my other grandmother, she had one of those big console stereos that was like a massive piece of furniture, against the wall. You opened up this big lid and the record player was inside. And my aunt had left a lot of her records there. And one of them was a 45. There were two 45s that I played relentlessly every time I went over her house. And the first one was Hound Dog by Elvis Presley. And I would put the big headphones on with the curly cable where you could only walk about 4 feet before it started pulling you back. I listened to that, and I listened to a song by Bobby Darin called Splish Splash, right? Have you heard that one?
Oh, yeah. Is it Splish Splash? I was having a bath?
Yeah, exactly. It's that goofy song. Bill Haley, Rock Around the Clock. I mean, I always, for whatever reason, I was just, something in me was triggered the minute I heard music. Like that is for me. Whatever that is for me. I'm into it. And that intensified, to your original point, once I first heard, like, to me, the heavier the better. And by the time I got to the Sabbath stage and then beyond that into other metal bands, I was, sold. Sign me up. This is for me. Absolutely.
So you were listening to Masters of Reality around age 10.
Yeah.
Where from there?
From there, it went to, Sabbath was the first 6 Sabbath albums I dove headfirst into. Absolutely. The next thing that happened at a very young age is there's a record store down the street from my cousin's house called the Bear's Den. And so we were already at a point around, let's say 12, where we thought records were just the coolest thing ever. So my parents or my aunt would give us some spending money. So we would go down to Bear's Den just to look at the records. And we would go down there for a long time because we couldn't afford stuff in a lot of cases. So we would wait and pool our money. And eventually, I remember this day, the one day we went down there, we could actually buy something. Right. So for months, who knows how many months on end, we've been looking at these records and just eyeing up the covers like, wow, that is so cool. You know what metal records look like, right? These amazing, fantastic fantasy scenes or whatever. So the record I bought was Judas Priest, Unleashed in the East. And we go home, and we put the thing on the stereo and again, just head exploded. This is the most amazing thing I've ever heard. It's live. There's an audience. There's dual guitars and there's this guy who has a range that is so inhumanly high. I'd never heard anything like that in my entire life. So that was it. The big ones for me have always been Sabbath, Priest, Maiden, Ozzy. Those were the foundations because they all sort of happened around the same time. Somewhere a couple of years after that, I remember coming home from school. I used to listen to the radio, WMMS out of Cleveland. Come in my room. The ritual was come in my room, put my books down, turn on the radio, right? Because the DJ in the afternoon played a lot of harder, heavier music. So one day I'd do that. I'd turn the radio on and Iron Maiden's Killers comes out of the speakers. Same thing. Talk about an amazing intro to a song. You got that galloping bass happening. There's tension. There's drama. There's, and then the scream. Wow! I'm paying attention. That first guitar slices in. That descending, whatever it is. Man, I can't overestimate this. To those songs to this day, give me the same chills and the same intense emotional reaction that I had at that age. To me, it felt like a whole new world.
Were you a collector? You discovered Sabbath, you discovered those bands. Did you go and sort of try to find everything else you could from those bands?
Yes. Not just records, okay? And in those days when we couldn't afford things, you would find people who had the records and then you would tape them on a cassette, right? So when cassettes came about, that was like the greatest gift ever because now you could pilfer other people's collections and have tapes. We had those big boxes of portable tapes with a strap on it. You put the strap on your shoulder and it's it weighs 9,000 pounds where you're walking crooked because it's so heavy. But yeah, all the music I can get my hands on and magazines, music magazines, just relentless. I had an aunt who had a beauty shop and next to the beauty shop was a Troutman's Drugstore, and Troutman's Drugstore sold magazines, and they sold a lot of music magazines. So I would just pester her to take me in there, and she would, God bless her, she would do it, and she would buy me music magazines with like Hit Parader or Circus, or there's another one I'm forgetting. But yeah, I wanted every piece of information I could possibly get about these bands, without question. I was obsessed.
So that's a good point, because you're talking about, you're looking for information, and this is, believe it or not, there was no internet at some point in the past.
Right.
How do you get to learn about those new bands, new music, these connections?
People. And like I mentioned, the cassette thing, right? Like tape trading, people making each other mixtapes was a big thing. And that's when they were actually mixtapes. They were cassettes. So my friends and I, and even casual acquaintances, right? Friends you meet through friends, start talking about music. They're like, oh my God, I just got this. It's really cool. I'm going to make you a tape. And they would make you a tape. And then you, in return, to say thank you, would make them one back. So that's how I learned about just about everything. Plus, if you're lucky in your life, you have at least one kid in the neighborhood who, for whatever reason, has their ear to the ground somehow in a way that you don't, and is just aware of everything. For us, that was a friend of my cousin's who became a friend of mine. His name was Jim Donadio. This dude, he knew everything about everything before it came out. You know what I mean? He knew about all these British bands. He knew about the punk and post-punk and, bands like U2 when they were nobody. Donadio just knew about everything, and he always had a record, and he always had the cassette, or he would make you a mix, or it was just a fount of knowledge. So we would just go to his house, I think simply just to be in his presence, like just educate us. And he was also the first person I ever knew who was actually in a band. He was a drummer. I think in those days, if you were lucky to know somebody like that, you learned a lot, but all the information you got came from other people because mainstream media didn't cover it, right? The best you could hope for were magazines, metal magazines, and other human beings. And that was pretty much it.
I must admit, I'm not a huge metal fan. I listen to some Sabbath. I listen to some other things that you can say they're a bit on the heavier side. But I mean, metal as a master genre has so many subgenres.
Ugh, endless.
What are some of the things that you find yourself attracted more to within this massive genre?
Yeah, and I'll tell you something interesting just for point of fact. I don't think there's only one genre that I don't like of music. I'm equally obsessive, quite frankly, about all of it. The only genre I don't like is like modern country makes me crazy. It's like overproduced, slick, terrible pop music. Anyway, metal, I gravitate towards certain things. I'm very picky. Most people who know me, like my friend Chuck that I do a Hard Volume Experience podcast with, will tell you that I am more picky than your average stadium full of people in terms of, I'm judgmental. So for me, there are a lot of things that have to be right. There has to be a vocalist who doesn't have to be an amazing singer necessarily, but has to be distinct, really super distinct. Like there's 1,000 guys that growl, okay? There's 1,000 guys who have high-pitched screaming voices. Only a handful of them are truly unique, right? I'm a big deal. Production is a big thing with me. If something is too flat, too muddy, or too slick, too overproduced, if the mix is too buried, if the guitars are buried, if the voice is too far ahead in the production mix, I'm going to complain. It's how I am. But to answer your original question about genres, I'm looking at my record collection right now. I'm trying to think this through. The majority of my stuff, I think, falls under the definition of sort of more traditional metal, I guess. To this day, huge Judas Priest fan, Ronnie James Dio. Like Dio with Sabbath was one of the greatest things that ever happened in history as far as I'm concerned. Iron Maiden is absolutely at the top of my list. I was a huge fan of all the Ozzy records, a huge Motorhead fan, although they're more like sort of veering into punk than metal, but that tends to be my genre. Now, at the same time, there are lots of metal bands who vary from that, like Helmet. I loved when they came out. They're so heavy and so percussive, and so but it's not that traditional power metal kind of thing. Huge Opeth fan. I think this is one of the greatest bands in the history of the universe. Their range is unreal. They're like a prog band in a metal band's body or something. I mean, shift effortlessly between all those things. And he's one of those guys who has that growl that's incredibly distinct, and he's a beautiful, clean singer. I like Lamb of God a lot. Randy Blythe is another one of those guys who's a growler, but it's distinct. It's uniquely his. The way he does it is uniquely him. There are lots of heavy and hard rock instrumental type bands that certainly veer into metal. I love instrumental music. Love it. I'll go out of my way. I'll swim through an ocean to hear an instrumental record of any kind. There are bands like Chuck and I are really into this band called Slift, and every other day we're texting each other to talk about, new sort of discoveries. He'll throw me something he's listening to, and I'll throw him something back. But I like I like the more expansive, adventurous type stuff. I don't like things that are really formulaic. I like anything that is emotionally impactful. I've got to feel it, and I've got to feel it in the musician's delivery, in that every single person has to be attacking that music like they mean it. Like it matters to them so much that this is just an extension of who they are, right? There has to be an emotion. It has to hit me here in my heart. It has to move me in some way. Like lyrics are a very big deal to me. If the lyrics are dumb, if they're sophomoric, if they're cliched, I'm like, even bands I love, okay, there are certain songs I just outright skip, like, whatever. I like the things that speak to, I don't know, real things, real emotions that sound honest. Even if it's fantasy type stuff, you can do that in a way where there's a commitment there that you can hear. Prog bands do this all the time. I don't know how to describe it. It's like this intangible realness that has to exist in the music for me to be like, yeah, that's awesome.
So that's interesting, because it raises another thing for me, which is you were talking about how you're sort of like growing with the genre of heavy metal, reading magazines. At some point, it starts seeping into the mainstream. You have Headbangers Ball on MTV. It becomes the image of metal, sometimes even supersedes the music itself. How are you taking that?
Well, the first time, and this is funny, the first time I told you about the Judas Priest album, Unleashed in the East, leather and studs and chains, and I thought that was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. Now, Rob Halford has talked at length about where that look came from. You know what I mean? He's looking around in like S&M shops and, some of the gay districts in different cities. But to me, that was tough. That was like biker type stuff. It was just cool. It was cool to have a uniform. It was cool to have an outfit. Even Iron Maiden didn't quite go that far, but they sort of had like cut off t-shirts and spandex, still that kind of thing. Now, when it got into the hair metal thing, I wasn't digging that at all. It was just kind of goofy to me. I didn't care so much about the feminine aspect of it. It just seemed goofy. Like, to me, they were making fun of it in a way, and I didn't like that very much. I loved the look. I loved it. I would get excited, especially because I was a lot younger. I would get excited when, for a new album or a new tour, like Priest would have new outfits. Like, that was a big deal to me. Like, oh, did you see what they're wearing? This is really cool. So the look was part of that. The show was part of that. The explosions and the flames and the, Rob Halford descending from a steel scaffolding when he was singing Electric Eye. And it was just the attitude of it all and the theatrics of it all were just as much fun as everything else, and that's the part that you can't ever necessarily communicate to your parents, who are worried about this music that you're listening to that has references to, the devil or whatever. Like, a band's called Judas Priest. Like, what does that mean? Iron Maiden always had this half-dead zombie mascot on its covers, and the one album was called The Number of the Beast. Like, to me, it was just all fun. It was all fun like horror movies are fun, and I never took any of it that way. So I was always, and to this day, I'm sort of mystified by people who sort of feel like that's a thing. I'm like, well, you're not really paying much attention. Even Sabbath was, put to task relentlessly. But if you read their lyrics, they're all about like, here's how to be a good human being. You should care about other people. Here's what religious hypocrisy looks like. People who preach something but don't practice it. To me, these were all like good, real things, I remember Ozzy had a song on Blizzard of Oz called Revelation, Mother Earth, because my mother was concerned about my music. I used to have to hide things from her. because she would take them. We do a whole therapy session about that. My father, at one point, she was bending his ear about it. So he's like, look, get one of your records and come downstairs and play this for me. I want to hear this music. I said, okay. So I got Blizzard of Oz, and he was reading the lyric sheet, as he's listening, and he was kind of totally okay with it. And I think Revelation of Mother Earth in particular talks about destroying the environment and all this kind of stuff. And he was like, okay, that makes sense to me. He's like, I'm not quite sure about the song about suicide, which is actually an anti-suicide song. And I remember he said to me, he's like, look, I don't have to like your music. I just don't want to hear it. So I don't know. I veered off track from what you originally asked me, I think.
No. It's all good. Did you adopt the metal look yourself?
When I was outside of the house, yes. I can tell the story now, and they know it. So I used to, when I went to school, my parents were not into that look at all. My mother especially was like, degenerates dress like that. So I would bring a gym bag to school because we had gym class. And in my gym bag were not only my gym clothes, there were my metal clothes, my metal t-shirts, my tight ripped jeans. At one point I had a little chain wallet that I used to wear, but I sort of had to do it in secret. When you're out with your friends, you dress a certain way. But I was always changing and then changing back when I went back in the house because it just wasn't acceptable. And society at that point was it's just a very different place. I mean, it was not acceptable to dress like that or have long hair or have tattoos, God forbid. Whereas now every third person you see has full sleeves of tattoos and earrings and, and everything else. I had an earring for a while and I used to take it out when I was in the house and the hole would kind of like partially close over and you'd be like, oh shit, you try to put it in the next time. So yeah, I did absolutely sort of adopt that.
So with the evolution of, no music genre stays static.
No.
How do you see the evolution of metal since you started listening to it through today?
Oh, I think it's expanded greatly. You have, like you said a minute ago, you have all these subgenres. What was first known as speed metal that turned into thrash, for example, talk about another major moment. Okay, that was a quantum leap. Metallica in particular was a quantum leap because they were the first band I heard like that. Metallica and Slayer. Again, my cousin gave me a tape. He's like, you have to hear this. On one side is Master of Puppets. On the other side is Ride the Lightning before that. I put this in and I listened to it and I don't know what to do with this. Like this is something just beyond, it's more extreme than anything I'd ever heard. And I loved it instantly. Like this is amazing because it was hugely dramatic. And they wrote really killer, catchy stuff and still do to this day. They're phenomenal songwriters. The next thing I heard was, I think it was Slayer's Rain in Blood. Same thing. Extremity to, and I'm like, that was one of the moments I categorized as, you can do that with music. The first time hearing Hendrix play the Star Spangled Banner was a, you can do that with music moment. The Master of Reality story I told you, same thing. Like you can do that. You can play like that. Priest was another one of those moments. Slayer and Metallica was another one of those moments. First time I heard like death metal and growling, deep growling in the vocals, an underground compilation by Earache Records. And all I can remember is that it had a tank on the cover. I still have the cassette. I know that for a fact. And it was all these underground bands like Carcass and Terrorizer, and it was all like, and I'd never heard anything like that before. I didn't necessarily care for it, but it was new enough and exciting enough that it was kind of like, okay, cool. And then now there's so many offshoots of all that. Like dark metal, you have this weird sort of prog goth symphonic sensibility that's infused in all that stuff. You have symphonic metal that's, the Nightwishes of the world, or Lacuna Coil, or some of those types of bands where you're mixing lots of styles. And I'm intrigued by all of it. I love all of it. I love when bands expand. I love when they try something different. I love when genres expand the way that metal has. I think that's fantastic. You'll meet people every so often who are purists, and they'll be like, oh, there's no good music out there. I'm like, are you kidding me? In every genre, there's a massive amount of music. And it's all at our fingertips. It's an embarrassment of riches right now. So to answer your question, I love the fact that it continues to change and evolve. I love the fact that I'm challenged. Even if I listen to something that I don't necessarily care for, I still truly enjoy the experience. It's just something to sort of expand your definition of what this is. And I always appreciate that, always.
How is your family with your love of metal? How are you? Said you have 3 kids. How are they taking it? Are they following in your steps?
Yes and no, in that my daughter, Julia, is very much into metal. Absolutely. Like, she was on board with all that stuff. You know what I mean? The classic stuff and the new stuff. And she's, again, she shows me bands that she likes. I've shown her bands that I like. And she's obviously more modern bands are really kind of her thing. Like, I think the first time I ever heard Black Veil Brides was through her. And there are a couple other bands that are totally escaping me right now. I can't remember. Anyway, so, and she's into all sorts of music as well. Sophia, who's the youngest, is into all kinds of music as well. And she has gotten really into old school metal, like old school Black Sabbath. Like, we trade that the first time I played some of that for her, I can't remember whether she heard it. She's like, I know you've had to have heard this. And I listened to it and I was like, yes, this is like Sabotage era stuff, which is my favorite Sabbath record, Sabotage. So yeah, she's digging it now. And my son is into some of that same kind of stuff as well. I think he's more of I don't even want to say that. I mean, he's very into hip hop, obviously. All 3 kids are very into hip hop, and sort of what's current. They were all into different various aspects of electronic music. Like, my son was into dubstep for a while, which I thought was really cool, because dubstep to me felt like metal. It was so loud and so heavy, and so I'm like, this is kind of like metal. So he's all over the place. All 3 of them really are all over the place with their musical taste. But I don't think any of them are as obsessive. Like I said, I love all genres. I will talk your ear off about jazz all day long, and prog as well. Okay, absolutely in love with all that stuff. But metal's always going to be my first love. If you get me talking about metal, we'll be here all year. That's just kind of how it is. So I don't know that anybody's as obsessive about it as I am. To the nth detail. That's why Chuck and I get along so well, is that we're both really into details, having to know everything.
There are people, of course, not everyone likes every genre of music. There are people who you tell them, oh, I listen to metal, and they say, oh, that's just noise.
Yeah.
That's just people screaming into a microphone. What are some of the bands you would recommend to sort of get people to see metal in a different way?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, I would do 2 things now, because I discovered the, I believe it's the Russian Symphony Orchestra, the RSO. Last year, I came across this, and they did a bunch of Iron Maiden songs. It was like 7 Iron Maiden songs that are the most beautiful things that you have ever heard in your entire life. It's just astounding. Okay, beautiful classical music played by a symphony. And it absolutely proves the point that these compositions are on equal par with any piece of classical music that has ever been written. Okay, so what I would do first is I would expose them to that record, okay? Listen to this, and then I would play them the Maiden originals. Because your brain goes, you got to be kidding me. Like, if I was someone who felt like, okay, metal's noise, and I was confronted with both those things in that order, mind blown. Okay, and I've done that off and on, with my parents. I remember I was sitting with my father one time. He said, yeah, but it's just all abrasive noise. And I said, let me show you something. I got an acoustic guitar, and I said, here are some of the same chords to what I was just listening to, and I played it that way. And he's like, that's not the same. I said, it is the same. Same notes, same order, same sequence, same melody line, same cadence. Now I'm a musician too, so I feel like it's easier to explain maybe for me, but people who say it's just noise, you're reacting to the presentation of it. You're reacting to the effect that is on the instruments, not the instruments themselves. If you listen to those things put forward in a different affected way, or in a natural way with no effects, right? Just stringed instruments, you hear a very different thing.
Amazing. Joe, where can people find you?
You can find me all over social media, but the 2 big places are givegoodux.com, which is my public website for my consulting and teaching and training, and lots of freebies for people who are into UX and product design and stuff like that. And then my UX 365 Academy, which is an online training thing for folks. That's at www.ux365academy.com. And I don't have the URL off the top of my head, but Chuck Borowitz and I do an occasional podcast called The Hard Volume Experience, which I would absolutely love if people would check out. It is on YouTube. So if you go to YouTube and type in Hard Volume Experience, or if you type in Joe Natoli, Hard Volume Experience, or Chuck Borowitz, Hard Volume Experience, you will find it. All those places. I love having the opportunity to do this. I need to thank you for indulging me, for doing all this stuff. It was a great ask. I think you were doing one of the coolest things I have ever heard of. We are more than our job. We're more than our career, and we have to be. That's part of what makes you feel like you're alive.
It absolutely does. Joe, thank you so much for sharing that passion with us today.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
This is all for this episode of Design Downtime. Thank you for joining me. And until next time, I hope you enjoy your downtime.